Hello, and welcome to Shut Them Down, Fighting the Immigration Detention Crisis. We're just going to give folks a minute or two to show up and come into the space, and we'll get started. We're excited to have you today. Great. Hello, everyone. Hello again. Welcome to today's event, Shut Them Down, Fighting the Immigration Detention Crisis. My name is Cynthia Totten, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director at Just Detention International. My pronouns are she, her. JDI is a health and human rights organization that works to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. To learn more about what we do, please visit our website, which will be linked in the chat. And before we get started, I want to mention that we have interpretation available today. As you'll see on the slides, you can click on the globe at the bottom and select your preferred language. We have a Spanish speaker on our panel, so if you do not understand Spanish, please make sure you select the English channel. And for Spanish speakers, please click the option for the Spanish channel. We also have an ASL or American Sign Language option, and our ASL interpreter also can be viewed by clicking the globe on the bottom of the screen. And I'd also like to mention that we are captioning enabled and we are recording. So right now, I'm going to pause for a moment so folks can get on the correct channel for your language. And if you have any trouble, please do message us in the chat. Now, we will have opportunities for you to say hi or comment or ask questions or put some finger snaps in the chat if you like what you're hearing today throughout the event. You can also post questions in the Q&A box. And right now, we welcome you to say hi and tell us where you're tuning in from in the chat box, where you can also post comments throughout the event. So this event is the final one of a series of 3 virtual sessions looking at the state of the movement to end sexual abuse behind bars. We began the series with a wonderful open house that gave folks an inside look at JDI's work to end prisoner rape and support survivors. And then 2 weeks ago, we had a very lively and critical conversation about anti-racism and the movement to end sexual abuse in detention. Today, we are turning our attention to the crisis of sexual abuse in immigration detention and what we can do to fight for the safety of those who immigrate to our country and come into contact with our immigration detention system. I would like to start by giving some background to the immigration detention system. Nationwide, there is a network of detention centers that consists of facilities run by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, or that have contracts with ICE. This system has grown exponentially in the past 3 decades, and in 2023, it held over 273,000 immigration detainees. And then there's the many thousands of people who are detained each month at Customs and Border Patrol, or CBP, facilities along our borders. People may end up in immigration detention settings for a number of reasons. Some of them may have crossed the border seeking asylum or for other reasons. Others may have been in the country for years, but have been found to be undocumented after getting picked up for a traffic violation or other minor infraction. Still others may have been transferred there from state or federal prisons after serving their sentence and are now awaiting deportation. Some of these individuals are detained for a matter of a few weeks, while others wait for years, either to be deported or to have their case processed. It's not just adults, of course, who are locked up. Children enter the country at the border, sometimes with their families, and when they do, many are separated from their parents. There are also unaccompanied minors who enter the U.S., meaning that they cross the border without a parent or guardian. Every year, more than 100,000 unaccompanied minors are transferred from Customs and Border Patrol, not to ICE, but to a different government agency, which is Health and Human Services, and specifically Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement. In spite of the fact that unaccompanied minors usually are traveling to meet with family, they still spend about a month and sometimes more in government-run shelters. Now, sexual abuse is widespread in immigration detention facilities and shelters, but the truth is that we don't really know the extent of the problem. The group Freedom for Immigrants revealed that between May 2014 and July 2016, there was, on average, more than one complaint of sexual abuse from people in immigration detention each day. However, less than 3% of those complaints were investigated. Between 2016 and 2020, the Office of Refugee Resettlement received 7,467 reports of sexual misconduct involving an unaccompanied migrant child. I want to point out that we know that some of this data is old, and that in and of itself underscores a key part of the problem, which is the lack of information about what is happening in these facilities to the individuals that are in them. In addition, this data is only the tip of the iceberg. The reality is the incidence of sexual abuse in immigration detention facilities and shelters is almost certainly much higher than we know about because of the massive barriers to reporting for individuals in immigration custody. It goes without saying that even one instance of sexual abuse is too many, and every single person, regardless of their immigration status, deserves to be safe and free from violence, and has a right to be. It is clear that the treatment of adults and children in immigration detention facilities is egregious in many respects and violates their basic human rights. That is why JDI believes in ending the expansion of these detention centers and ultimately shutting them down for good. We also want to acknowledge that we're living in a moment of open hostility toward immigrant communities by politicians, in particular immigrant communities made up of people who are Black and brown and poor, and that this rhetoric has real implications for the safety of people living in these communities and people who are in immigration detention. We hope to challenge this rhetoric through this conversation today and through our ongoing advocacy on behalf of people in immigration detention. While the scope of this problem is large, there are so many dedicated advocates working to end this abuse and protect the human rights of adults and children who immigrate to this country. Some of those advocates are here with us today, and I'm so excited to have this conversation with these experts in the field, who I will now introduce to all of you. So we are joined today by Julia Abbate, who is my colleague. She's our National Advocacy Director at JDI. Jonathan Beier, who is the Associate Director of Research and Evaluation for the Unaccompanied Children Program at the Acacia Center for Justice. Stacy Suh, who is the Program Director at Detention Watch Network, and Esmeralda Soto, who is a member of JDI's Survivor Council. Welcome to all of you. It's so great to have all of you with us here today. Before we get started, I want to remind folks in the audience to click on the globe at the bottom of your Zoom window and select your preferred language if you haven't already done that. Also, please feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A box or in the chat throughout our discussion, and we will try to get to them during our Q&A portion. So let's start it off, guys. I'd love to start with you, Esmeralda. You're a member of our Survivor Council at JDI and a fierce advocate for incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse. Personally, I've known you now for many years, throughout your work with JDI, and it's been wonderful to be able to do this work side by side. Esmeralda, you experienced abuse while in an ICE-run jail. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience and how you found the courage to become an advocate? I think you're muted, Esmeralda. Could you unmute? There you go.
Mi nombre es Esmeralda Soto. Soy sobreviviente y activista con GDI por 20 años y mi experiencia que pasé en detención de migración es una experiencia muy mala que es no es aceptable porque estar detenidos uno ahí uno no puede tener la libertad de poder explicar o hablar de lo que uno le haya pasado ahí. Entonces es muy traumante y es por eso que yo me he convertido en una activista para que no siga pasando lo mismo que yo pasé, personas indefensas que están ahí detenidas por alguna razón que quieren tener una mejor vida en este país. Y pues ese es mi punto de vista.
Yeah, thank you, Esmeralda, so much. Thank you for sharing. I know we are all so sorry about what you went through. And at the same time, like I said, we've all been blown away by your activism during these past 20 years. So thank you for that. And of course, sadly, what happened to you is far too common. We know that this abuse in immigration detention is widespread based on dozens of news reports and other brave survivors like you, Esmeralda, who have come forward. So let's turn to Julie and ask, given that context that Esmeralda just described so aptly, what are the dynamics of sexual abuse in these immigration detention facilities? And what are the barriers to providing support and for survivors to come forward?
Thanks, Cynthia. So the dynamics of sexual abuse in ICE immigration detention centers is pretty much the same as in any prison or jail, because really that's what we're talking about. These facilities are actual prisons. Some of them are privately run, some of them run by ICE. And some of these facilities are county jails that lock up folks from the county as well. So every single aspect of custodial detention, if you're a prisoner or an inmate, is present when you're in an ICE facility. You come in through intake, through a sally port, you get stripped out, you get your uniform on, and then you're processed in and assigned your housing unit. It looks like a prison, it smells like a prison, it feels like a prison. It is a prison. And as such, of course, it's completely isolated and cut off from the rest of us, right, on the outside. There's no entry into these facilities to see what's going on. Further, it's complicated by language barriers oftentimes, and folks that may be newly arrived to the country who are disoriented and confused and locked up like a prisoner in these facilities. So that creates a huge barrier to trying to get help to folks who do experience sexual abuse behind bars. There are a number of local rape crisis centers who do have contracts or MOUs, memorandums of understanding, with these facilities where folks can reach out. Whether or not they're utilized, though, is a different story. I'm not sure what the statistics are on that, but it's basically identical to sexual abuse in any other jail or prison, because that's what these are.
Thank you, Julie. So Jonathan, let's shift over to you and talk about unaccompanied minors. What steps are being taken to make sure that the shelters that those children are housed in are safe? What are the barriers to helping these kids?
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. I think I'll take that in reverse order because it really starts with the barriers. Then we can talk about how we're better protecting children now. And I think we need to start at the personal level. We need to think about who these children are. So you mentioned earlier These are kids who have traveled long distances, and they're really excited about joining, in almost every case, a family member living in the United States. But there's this period of time when they're in government custody before they can be placed safely with that family member, where they're in detention. And we need to remember that detention is not a healthy place for any kid, whether they're an immigrant or not. That's the first thing. Then you think about what they've been through up to this point to get into the United States. They've left really dire circumstances in many cases in their countries of origin. The journey to the United States is itself very long, very dangerous. And unfortunately, this means we can expect that nearly all unaccompanied children in ORR's care have experienced trauma in one form or another. And that makes them particularly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. And then finally, as Julie mentioned, thinking about what it means to be in a new country. So there's lots of things that put them at greater risk, and particularly if they don't speak the same language as the people who are caring for them in these facilities, that also makes them more vulnerable. When we look we think about the solutions, and there are some very important steps that ORR has been taking recently to improve protections for children. The first is simply that there are detailed policies in place to make sure that anytime there's an allegation of sexual misconduct involving an unaccompanied child, that there's a trauma-informed approach to how that's addressed and investigated. It's really important that ORR make sure that those guidelines are actually upheld in practice. ORR also has very detailed guidelines for requiring specific reports and disclosures when an allegation is made. Typically, that can involve reports to state licensing authorities and sometimes local law enforcement. But really critically, ORR has formalized recently an absolutely essential step, which is anytime a child is involved in an allegation of abuse or harassment, that the attorney providing services will be notified within 48 hours of that allegation. And that is so important because it's the attorneys who can make sure that the children are well represented, that they're being vigorously defended, and all of their rights are advocated for. And one last thing I wanted to say is ORR, as part of HHS, has recently had a number of new regulations put in place to improve the unaccompanied children program. There are lots of improvements there. One key item is the Office of the Ombuds for Unaccompanied Children, which is an external body outside of OR, but within HHS, that can receive complaints and conduct its own investigations. And so having that type of oversight is also a very much welcome strengthening of policy. I'll stop there for now.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. It's great to hear that there is at least some increased amount of oversight happening. Stacy, you've also been working in this space for a long time, and I wanted to ask you a big picture question about the system. It's a patchwork of so many agencies, as we've talked about. What changes have you seen over the years? Is the system growing? Is it more opaque? Is it more privatized? And of course, anyone can chime in, but Stacy, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you to the Just Detention International team for putting this important conversation together. I have to say, I'll start with the positive because we need some good news these days. But I think one positive trend that I want to name is that there is a growing national consensus to shut down immigration detention and move away from detaining immigrants. And so that has looked like local successes of shutting facilities down, but also state level legislation that works to phase out detention in that particular state. And a number of states have done that. So that's definitely a positive trend that I want to highlight. Also, the number of people detained have gone. It's a little bit of a complicated story with the number of people in detention. But when the Biden administration came in, because of the COVID-related harsh border policies, as well as actually sanctuary policies that have been really effective at keeping people out of detention in the first place, the number of people detained in 2021 were at a historic low. So Biden-Harris administration had a unique opportunity to reverse course and really shrink the system. Unfortunately, they have not done that and have doubled down on harsh border policies with the recent announcements around, more restrictions around people crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, making it harder to seek asylum. And of course, that disproportionately affects survivors of violence as well. And so we have been seeing the number of people being detained going up in the last couple of years, which is unfortunate. The other piece that I want to name too is that the system has been evolving. So the so-called alternatives to detention, which are just another ways to surveil and monitor greater number of people, that program has really expanded drastically in both methods and the number of people that that so-called alternative is subjected to. And what I mean by so-called alternatives to detention are actually GPS monitoring, ankle monitors, watches, as well as house arrest for migrant families that are coming to the US that are subjected to fast-track deportations. And last trend I'll highlight is that we are right now in this moment experiencing potential threats of detention expansion. So we have found in our research that whenever there is greater detention capacity, there's more likelihood or greater correlation with greater enforcement in the area. So meaning more people are funneled into the system. And unfortunately, ICE has been putting out feelers to see where they could increase their detention capacity, whether it's at an existing facility or at a new facility. So we're very concerned about that and are continuing to fight against these potential expansions.
Yeah, unfortunately, if they build it, they will fill it, as the saying goes. Jonathan or Esmeralda, Julie, did anyone else want to chime in on that question? Stacy certainly gave us a lot to think about. Okay, so Esmeralda, were you about to say something? Just come off mute.
Yo lo que he pensado siempre es de que ¿por qué estar en detención es como si fuese uno un criminal? O sea, no es aceptable de que una persona que quiera una mejor vida sea detenida y estar en los castigos, como en mi caso yo estuve castigada simplemente nada más por ser quien yo soy. Estuve les llamaba segregation, es unas celdas donde no nos daba ni el sol, no veíamos nada, ni cuando era de día ni cuando era de noche. Entonces es muy frustrante ver que a niños estén pasando por esto. No es aceptable, no se me hace bien para esa gente que quiere mejor vida.
Yeah, thank you, Esmeralda. Thank you. And focusing in on the question of children, as you just did there, the Department of Justice has filed a lawsuit against a nonprofit called Southwest Key that provides housing to unaccompanied children. The lawsuit charges that there was sexual abuse and harassment of children. Jonathan, I wanted to ask, can you talk about the significance of this lawsuit?
Absolutely. This was a really important step for the government to take. As you mentioned, Southwest Key is one of the largest care providers in ORR's facility network. It operates dozens of different facilities, Texas, Arizona, California. And unfortunately, it's also been one of the worst at protecting children in its care from abuse. So for this summer, the federal government, through the Department of Justice, to file its suit over Southwest Key's poor history in this area is really critical. To give some context of that, a few years ago, there was a congressional report reviewing incidents of sexual abuse of unaccompanied children in ORR's care. It was put out by the Senate Finance Committee. And among the recommendations that the committee offered was that they insisted that there has to be some consequence for facility operators that are repeated bad actors. Now, in the context of the report, they framed it in terms of contracting. You know, we shouldn't be renewing the contracts of a company or a nonprofit that doesn't keep children safe. What the DOJ's lawsuit is I think, a really important complement to that. It's a different type of consequence, but what it seeks through the lawsuit is an outcome that will force Southwest Key to clean up its act and better protect children in its care. And also, I think, just as importantly, compensate survivors. So I think it's a very welcome development.
Well, thank you for that, Jonathan. Julie, do you want to add anything about the suit's ramifications and what it could mean for this work going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. I think that one of the important aspects of DOJ's case is that it's seeking injunctive relief. That is, it's seeking changes in the future to strengthen the systems and strengthen procedures and trainings so that these types of abuses don't happen again in the future. And as with any correctional institution or detention facility, I really do want to emphasize that there are, in fact, amazingly dedicated, committed staff members working in Southwest Keys right now. Absolutely, without question. And so what the injunctive relief is designed to do is to give these staff members what they need to ensure that children remain safe in their custody. Because so much emphasis is often placed on reporting, and to have a child come forward and tell a stranger speaking a different language that something happened to them sexually is incomprehensible to me to believe that many people can do that. So more focus on preventing sexual abuses from occurring, from detecting red flags that could show that there could be abuses that may occur, and to detect changes in the children in custody to make sure that even if they never say a word, that they remain protected. So that's what I'm hoping that will come out of this, in addition to compensation for the survivors, help for the folks who want to run these facilities well and to keep these kids safe and get them reunited with their families as soon as possible.
Yeah, prevention, right? I mean, you just put your finger on the key issue there, is how do we prevent this abuse so that children don't have to come forward and try to make a report under those circumstances. So I wanted to turn back to something that I had started to touch on earlier, which is that right now we're living in an environment where anti-immigrant sentiment is widespread, to the point where political leaders are openly hostile to immigrant communities. The Republican Party is threatening thousands of people with detention and deportation, promising, as Donald Trump put it, to carry out the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. At the same time, the Democratic Party has an appalling track record on immigration policy, and the administration supports the expansion of ICE detention facilities, as Stacy was mentioning a second ago. So what is it like to advocate in this climate? Esmeralda, do you want to chime in first?
Ah, no sé. Sí, yo pienso que usar a los inmigrantes por venir a querer tener un buen futuro acá en este país está hecho de inmigrantes. So, si algunos han hecho cosas malas, no quiere decir que el resto de toda la gente que viene a este país es es mala. No estoy de acuerdo que pongan como ejemplo de venir atacando a los inmigrantes para poder tener un puesto en el gobierno. Pienso que deberían enfocarse más en progresar más el país, en tener mejores trabajos, en no tener más discriminación, en no atacar en ese punto de atacar a la gente. De por sí hay mucha discriminación y luego con eso de que ellos como líderes que están muy altos en reconocidos que quieren ser presidentes o gobernadores y atacar a los inmigrantes, no se me hace bien. Pueden llevar una política de otra forma no utilizando a los inmigrantes, porque este país es hecho de inmigrantes.
Yeah, well said, Esmeralda. Thank you. Did anyone else want to weigh in on that question about the current climate? Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
Sure. As you mentioned, I work at the Acacia Center for Justice. We're an organization that's committed to immigrant legal defense. And specifically, I work on issues of unaccompanied children. I can say that the heat of the political moment really makes it harder to protect children, and also to ensure that they actually have a fair shot when they're seeking immigration legal relief. There's hateful, dehumanizing rhetoric all around. It's so harmful. And I just want to emphasize, I'm a developmental psychologist, and children are not oblivious to how they're being spoken about. So separate from the politics of immigration, these are children who are learning about who they are and forming their own identity, as all children do. And to hear such hateful things about them is not a good thing. Separate from that, though, is that this rhetoric, it just stops us from building better policies. We need to fix so many of the broken parts of our immigration system, and these sensationalized ways of talking about it don't do us any favors.
Wow, thank you. And it's just heartbreaking to think about children kind of taking this in, all of this hateful rhetoric. So let's pivot to the question of abolition in the context of immigration detention. Stacy, can you talk a little bit about the Detention Watch Network's work with regards to halting the expansion of immigration detention and closing existing facilities, and give us any examples?
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. So I think it's important to note that it's no coincidence that US not only maintains the largest prison system in the world, but also the largest immigration detention system in the world. And so we focus on detention in particular because that's where border enforcement policies and interior enforcement policies meet, essentially to facilitate deportation. So detention is what allows ICE, for example, to coordinate logistics, make sure that it is possible to deport as many people as possible. It also is intentionally designed to inflict harm and violence on people that are detained, to coerce people into signing their deportation order, and that includes sexual violence as a core feature of the system. And so we believe that detention cannot be reformed, and that we should end it and shut it down, and free people from detention. And I think as much as we have had challenges, we have also had a lot of successes. So two examples I'll bring up. The first one is the end of the ICE contract at Irwin Detention Facility in Georgia. This facility, I don't know if folks remember, during the Trump administration, there was a whistleblower nurse that came forward along with survivors of forced and unconsensual gynecological procedures that came forward and spoke out about the abuse. And that, of course, came in partnership with a lot of the amazing local organizations that have been working for years with detained people to make sure that those abuses were being spotlighted and addressed, and also to get people out of those facilities. So they were successful because it caused such a big turning point for the campaign. Eventually, the Biden administration in 2021 ended the ICE contract, basically terminating the contract. And it was one of the first times where an administration proactively ended an ICE detention contract in that way as a result of public pressure. And of course, it cannot be understated how important it was to have the survivors advocate for themselves so that something like that would never happen to another person again. And then the other example I want to point out is the stopping of expansion in Illinois. So for well over a decade, starting in 2011 or so, there were multiple proposals for detention expansion in Illinois. And because folks were organized, they were able to engage local community members, able to come together with formerly and currently detained leaders to able to speak out against the harm and the violence that the detention system creates. And then also were eventually able to pass state legislation to phase out detention. They were able to fight off against multiple expansions over a period of over a decade, and were very successful in doing so. So we know that, while the climate is hostile, and I think there's a tendency to dehumanize people who are in detention, and then also dehumanize immigrant communities as a whole. But we know that our work continues, and we remain steadfast in advocating for people to be able to be with their loved ones as they navigate their immigration case, and that we want these facilities to not exist at all.
Yeah, and thank you for those successes, Stacy. Those are important to hold on to. Jonathan, what does abolition mean in the context of unaccompanied children?
Yeah, thanks. It's a timely question because there's a lot of discussion that many of the people attending this conversation may have heard about. Not just about incidents of sexual abuse involving children in ORS care, but also some of the challenges that they face after they join sponsors and start living in U.S. communities. So you may have seen news reports about things like trafficking and labor exploitation. I think it's important to recognize that those are real issues, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that the solution is to keep children in detention for longer. So as I've insisted all along here is that the best place for a child is in a safe and loving family home, not in a OR facility. So what we need to do is not to favor policies that push children into detention or hold them in detention for longer, but to think about what it means to make them safe and protected in the community. So we have to affirm that they're best protected when placed in a vetted family home, as is the current policy, but done that in an expeditious way to make sure that it's a safe place for them to go and not to remain in congregate care. And once they're in those community homes, they need to receive a full set of support services, legal services, and social services to make sure that they're well supported. And if we're concerned about things like labor exploitation, we need to make it more possible for teenage unaccompanied children to get a work permit so that they can actually work outside of the shadows, so they're not exploited in that way. So there's lots of solutions that don't require us to put kids into detention or keep them in detention for longer.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And so I wanted to just, point out that at the same time that you guys are making these really important points about abolition, there are people in immigration detention right now, right, who need our help. But I want to state clearly also that even if there were 0 instances of sexual abuse in these detention facilities, or any abuses for that matter, these places would still be sites of incredible harm. So Julie, I wanted to ask, can you expand on this point? Why is it so important to push right now for abolition and closure of these facilities?
Yeah, sure. And I think you really made the point that these are institutions that are dehumanizing to people. And so if people don't need to be in them, and the immigrant community that we're speaking of do not need to be in them, they ought not be, because only bad things can happen when you're in those types of settings. Nothing good comes from being in any type of detention. It really doesn't. And so right now it seems like the easiest thing is just like, oh, let's build more, expand capacity. That's how we'll address this problem. But it will be the most harmful thing to do. And so now is the time really to focus on community options that do not place people at harm, to really, like Stacy was saying, prevent the expansion of these types of facilities, because now's the time to do that and do it well, while we do have the spotlight. Well, this is a national issue. Doing meaningful, thoughtful, safe things for folks who come into our country, right? And as Jonathan was saying, ensuring that folks do not become increasingly vulnerable due to the inability to work legally, due to the inability to find housing or maybe get a driver's license. People need to be set up so in a manner that they are safe to become self-sufficient without relying on others who may prey upon them. And so the time is now. That we were tough on crime several decades ago. Now we've got this huge prison population, which is horrific. That will be what happens with immigration detention if we don't stop it, and stop it now. Now is the time to shut it down. There is no need for it. And so why should we use it? Focus instead on keeping folks safe in the community while they're here.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. And so just a sort of final question to wrap up our discussion. I mean, we could clearly keep talking for a few more hours, but I want to pose to all of you, what can those of us in the broader community do to support adults and kids who are in immigration detention right now? Stacy, did you want to have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I can start us off. I think this work is it's not easy, and I think it will take us, given the current climate, it's gonna take us a while to be able to have wins, and in the meantime, we want to make sure we protect people who are vulnerable to violence and abuse and detention. I really want to encourage folks to follow all of our work and to get plugged in. So there are multiple ways to get involved, whether find a local organization in your community that is working on deportation defense or shutting down a detention center in the area. There's also going to be opportunities to plug into federal advocacy. We know that regardless of who wins, the harsh border policies, the extreme funding that's going to go to ICE and CBP to detain and deport more people. All of those are threats regardless of who wins. And we're going to need to push back on those by pressuring our members of Congress to hold a line and oppose these investments that are going into systems that are hurting all of us, when those taxpayer dollars can actually go into providing people with basic things like housing, healthcare or education, or even just, healthcare, including mental health services for survivors as well. So really want to encourage folks to plug into existing campaigns. We will be putting out more resources as we have a better sense of what we're dealing with, and we'll have very concrete action to plug into. So really encourage folks to follow us and get engaged. So.
Yeah, and certainly the more awareness we all have of these issues, the better. Who else wants to chime in on what folks in the community can do to help? Esmeralda, did you want to say something?
Pues yo pienso que para ayudar a la comunidad que está detenida es, en mi caso, yo pues darle fortaleza y que tengan más paciencia para que todo vaya bien en su causa, en lo que estén pasando, porque de verdad yo como inmigrante sé lo que se siente, sé lo que es estar atado de pies y manos en una detención, y sobre todo que no es más si no saben el idioma, es muy, muy, muy triste el no saber el idioma y pues mucha fortaleza.
Well, thank you, Esmeralda, and thank you for that reminder of these. Thank you for that reminder. Julie or Jonathan, did either of you want to jump in?
Yeah, I never pass up an opportunity to jump in and say anything, so I would now be the first. But I think one thing I want to emphasize is that regardless of who wins the election, it is so completely important to keep up the pressure on our elected officials at the federal and at the state level. Oftentimes, Democratic administrations are seen as being more sympathetic to the issues and trying to treat people humanely. That does not mean that it's time for us to be quiet. On the contrary, it means it's time for us to be really, really louder, to give the folks the ammunition they need to take to the floor of whatever legislative body it is, to say, this is what we're hearing, to help them persuade folks who may not have the same mindset or may not have the same understanding. So it's never a time for complacency, and certainly not in any Democratic administration, certainly not the one that may be upcoming. And certainly if the Republicans win, then that's a whole other host of problems, because the anti-immigrant rhetoric trickles down, affects, permeates folks who run these facilities, certainly at the local county jail level. So we need to redouble our efforts to ensure the safety of those folks who are locked up. If you hear things going on in any detention facility, make a complaint to the DHS's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, CRCL. It's on the website, and any citizen can lodge a complaint about stuff that's going on. They will look into these issues and make sure that folks aren't being mistreated, and do their best to ensure that it doesn't happen to other people. But don't let down your guards just because the D's or the R's or whatever the case may be is in power or in office. It is never a time for complacency until all these facilities are shut down and folks are not in them anymore and subjected to these harms.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. We have to stay vigilant. We have to stay aware and ready to act. Jonathan, did you have something?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to absolutely underscore everything that my co-panelists have just shared. I mean, these are all really key steps, and I am very glad to hear that they've been offered. I'll offer two as well. The first is just simply at the local level. most likely in the community that you are, there's probably a local nonprofit that works with adults and children in immigrant detention. So think about ways to volunteer, donate, or even consider a job opportunity. I think there are ways to get directly involved. And then just speaking more broadly, so at Acacia, we're committed to the idea that every person in immigration hearings has a vigorous legal defense. But the problem is there's not enough lawyers to do that. Enough attorneys who know the ins and outs of immigration law. The supply just doesn't meet the need. So we actually have a contract with OR to expand the number of immigration lawyers who can work on unaccompanied children's cases, represent them, and advocate for their rights. It's called the Attorney Recruitment Project, and I just want to highlight it because it offers ways for both current lawyers as well as lawyers-to-be to get involved in this type of work. So if you're a law student, we have a 2-year fellowship opportunity that gives you that hands-on experience. If you're a seasoned lawyer, we also have ways to help you get placed in an office and have the sort of support like language training and interpretation services to help you make that shift from whatever your prior practice was. So I'll make sure that we also are sharing some links in the chat to both of those programs.
Wow, thank you, Jonathan. So now let's shift into our Q&A portion while we still have a little bit of time. I'm going to invite my colleague, Susana Contreras, to come on and let us know if there have been any questions coming in.
Thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions that have come in. So the first was via chat, and I'm going to pose this to Jonathan because it's about children. The question is, I have heard about children being held in immigration centers during the week and being able to go to foster parents' homes at night. Are immigrant children who are in these centers put up for foster programs?
Sure. So there are a number of different types of foster placements that ORR uses. One way to think about it is that there are short-term placements for children who will ultimately be placed in a family home with a sponsor, who again is typically their own immediate family member. And then unfortunately, there's also a smaller number of children who don't have an immediate viable vetted sponsor who may be placed in more long-term foster care arrangements. I think that what the chatter was referring to were these short-term or transitional foster care placements. So it's important first to recognize that they're not permanent. They are usually used specifically for children who are particularly vulnerable, that you shouldn't be keeping them, as in you shouldn't keep any children in congregate care, but particularly vulnerable ones like younger children or who, for instance, have a disability or something like that. So these are children who are placed in a foster care environment rather than the larger shelters. Now, the chatter is absolutely right that sometimes in those situations, there's sort of a day area where they would go and receive actual formal schooling or other types of activities, and then go to a foster care home at night. I can't speak to specifically the choice as to why that arrangement is the most commonly used one, but it's not the only one that's used. But maybe that answer just gives a little bit more context as to who these children are and in what situations and the duration of that arrangement.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for clarifying. We've had another question come in that says, I've often seen the term migrant used in a derogatory way, especially recently. And I noticed that today you were all using the term immigrant. Is there a correct term, and how can we talk about these issues in a more humanizing way? Stacy, would you like to take that one?
Sure. I mean, there's all these like legal human rights law definitions of like what constitutes a refugee, migrant, etc. I use them generally just colloquially, interchangeably, and yeah, I don't think it's a particular, well, I would just say that regardless of whether it's someone who's, just recently arriving to the US, no matter what the circumstances are, or if it's a long-term resident of someone who immigrated decades ago, like everyone deserves humanity and dignity and respect, and no one should be detained. And I think it's important to make sure that, people, even within communities, I think there's a lot of, diversity. Obviously, immigrant communities is not a monolith. It is a lot of different ethnic communities, races. There's also different gender identity, sexual orientation, and the diversity and the of the community is very expansive. And so we also want to make sure that the different communities, depending on when they have arrived and what their circumstances are not pitted against each other. And I think that's been somewhat challenging because we see that often where different communities of color are being pitted against each other, especially using newly arriving migrants or immigrants as scapegoats for societal problems like poverty.
Definitely. Does anyone else want to chime in on that question about language?
I just offer that although the experience of coming to the United States is a very foundational one in many people's lives, it's not the only thing about who they are. So I think it's also very helpful to think about that as one part of their life, and really to think about ways we can use person-centered terms to talk about the people who may have immigrated to the country, but also in a way that doesn't limit their identity to just that.
Thank you. Jonathan, can you talk more about the effects of detention on children? What is the age range of kids that are in immigration detention? Are there long-term impacts on them?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So just as a matter of demographics, the age range really varies from extremely young through children about to turn 18, but the vast majority, and about 3/4 or so, you can think of as adolescents. So in that, many of them between 15 and 17, another large group in the 13 to 14-year-old range, and about 1/4 of them younger than that. When we think about the effects of detention, there are so many, and unfortunately they can last because the longer you're exposed to detention, the more those effects compound. One way to think about it is that these are children who have made an extraordinary choice to leave their home and travel to the United States. And in many ways, they have had to take agency to do that, to decide to come through navigating all those hardships. And then all of a sudden, they're in a situation where they have very little agency, right? So that itself is such an abrupt shift that it can't be good for their mental well-being. Then there's also the uncertainty of how long you're going to be in detention. So on average, children may spend about a month or so in ORR's care before being placed with a sponsor, but some children end up staying in ORR's care for months longer than that. And the uncertainty of when finally that caseworker will be able to say, yes, your sponsor, your parent is approved to receive you into their home is itself a very difficult thing to work with when you are so clear in your mind about where you've been headed all along. There are, of course, all these other things we've been talking about, including risks of abuse and exploitation. The longer you're in these settings where the risks are elevated, the more likely that these traumatic things can also happen to you. So I would say there are many aspects of detention which are unhealthy, but the mere presence of being in detention and for each day longer is going to compound in ways that can have lasting effects. And the best way to address that is to get children out of detention quicker.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think we have time for one more question, but I do want to note that if we did not get to your question today, I'm going to be dropping an email in the chat so that you all can feel free to email us at Just Detention International, and we'll get back to you. So this last question is for Esmeralda. Esmeralda, it's amazing that you were able to come forward. Can you talk a bit about how you first became an activist for folks in immigration detention facilities?
Bueno, me convertí en activista porque cuando yo pasé el abuso en detención, yo traté de buscar ayuda, porque yo estaba pasando por una depresión severa que no tenía, con quién platicar porque era algo que solamente yo me tenía que quedar callada y no platicarle a nadie porque no quería hacer la burla de las demás personas con las que estaban conmigo en esa detención. Entonces yo pedí ayuda y solamente lo que hizo inmigración es mandarme a una detención me manejaron como por unas 8 o 6 horas al sur de California y para darme nada más unas pocas pastillas para un día y que se me quitara así ya eso. No, es muy deprimiente, fue muy deprimiente para mí, no tener la ayuda que yo necesitaba tener, porque yo necesitaba hablar, desahogarme, que alguien me entendiera lo que yo estaba sintiendo, más sin embargo no tuve esa ayuda. Y es por eso que yo busqué ayuda por otra fuentes afuera, y es como me involucré con GDI y ellos me ayudaron, y gracias a GDI yo me siento ahorita bien para poder hablar del tema y sin que yo tenga ese dolor o ese miedo, porque cuando fueron dos detenciones. Es la primera cuando me deportaron porque mi caso, yo renuncié a mi caso porque vino una inmigración, ¿qué se dice? Mi deportador, mi oficial de deportación vino a mi celda con mentiras diciéndome, ¿sabes qué? Queremos saber si estás bien aquí en la detención, y con mentiras. Como yo no sabía el inglés, entonces yo le dice, quiero que me firmes este papel. Y yo se lo firmé. En ese yo tenía una abogada, y yo le hablé a mi abogada, le digo, fíjate que vino un oficial y me hizo firmar un papel. Dijo, ¿para qué firmaste? Era tu deportación. Entonces todo eso a mí me hizo más venirme abajo y decir, yo renuncio a esto, yo me quiero ir a mi país, porque era algo que yo no soportaba estar ahí. Entonces yo tenía mucho miedo. Entonces, ya cuando me sacaron, estuve en una casa de una amiga, después me fueron por mí, que me iban a deportar. Y cuando yo llego a la detención, me dice un oficial, ¿no te mataron? Dije, ¿por qué? Dice, porque nosotros supimos que te habían matado. Le dije, no. Entonces yo entré mucho en pánico, porque era algo que yo no sabía, pero más sin embargo yo supe después que habían matado a otra chica que estuvo ahí conmigo. Y porque el mismo oficial de detención me dijo que esta persona estaba en una organización y que ellos se habían encargado de desaparecer a la muchacha, y eso a mí me entré mucho en pánico. Es por eso que yo estoy con GDI, y ellos me han ayudado bastante para que no siga pasando lo que yo pasé. Sí,
Wow.
así.
Well, thank you so much, Esmeralda. You've been through so much, and yet you have also helped so many people. We just thank you very deeply, all of us, for your amazing advocacy. So that really wraps up today's event. We're down to the last couple minutes. This was the last in this series on the movement to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. We will be sending an email with a recording of today's event and the 2 previous virtual events. And again, just a tremendous thank you to Jonathan, Stacy, Esmeralda, Julie. They all do such incredible work. And in the chat, we're going to put in information about how you can support the work Jonathan and his colleagues are doing at Acacia, and the work that Stacy and their colleagues are doing at Detention Watch Network. If you're interested in getting involved in JDI's work, there are a few ways you can do that. We always welcome contributions of any amount. You can click the link in the chat if you want to provide some support right now. Second, our yearly Words of Hope campaign has just begun, and this is an opportunity to send holiday greetings to people behind bars who often feel alone during the season. If you go to the link on the screen and in our chat, you can request cards, which we will mail to you. We're also asking people to write to their representatives to ask them to support the sexual abuse services Services in Detention Act, or SECITA, which was introduced in the House of Representatives last week. This critical bill would ensure that more incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse, people who are too often left to suffer alone, would get the care they need to begin to heal. So to participate in the Words of Hope campaign and to support SECITA, you can scan the QR codes that you see on the screen or go to the links in the chat. Your support is so valuable, and we just appreciate it, so tremendously. Thank you so much for tuning in and for your commitment to ending sexual abuse in detention. We'll see you soon. Thank you.